This podcast is made possible by listener members of Nashville Public Radio.
This is a special edition of the Nash Villager podcast. I'm Nina Cardona. Today, instead of a roundup of the latest news, we're celebrating the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the Nashvillians who joined Dr. King on the front lines of the civil rights movement. A little over a week ago, we had a reminder of just how many of those folks are at the end of their days. The youngest of the original freedom riders, Charles Pearson, died at the age of 82. In 1961, Pearson survived a savage beating in Anniston, Alabama, when his bus full of activists was firebombed and attacked by a white mob. Then in Birmingham, Pearson's group had another violent encounter, this time with members of the Ku Klux Klan. He was just 18 at the time. After those attacks, when it looked as if the freedom rides might end, Black students in Nashville took on the task, putting themselves at risk in hopes of making change. And several years ago, Nashville Public Radio's Versify podcast sought to capture the voices and stories of some of the surviving individuals from that heroic effort. This is one of them.
When people talk about the effect of silence during the Nashville student movement, they're referring to the march of thousands to the steps of Nashville City Hall. Silence as a tool to illuminate the strength of a movement. But it would ultimately also be used as a method of obscuring it.
There was a quietness about it. And as a whole, Nashville didn't really talk about it. It was like, it happened, it's over.
That's Etta Marie Simpson Ray, a freedom rider and one of the pioneers of the Nashville student movement.
I was in a juvenile justice class. And one of the young people here, I'm an old lady, said, well, that was in your day, this is in our day. Somehow or other, something got lost.
And while commemoration of the freedom rider's sacrifice came many years too late, the consequences for their involvement were immediate.
I can remember just her holding that letter in her hand, standing in the hallway in our house, and she was crying because I had been put out of school.
Somehow her clearest memory is afterwards, of her mother in the doorway of the bedroom, crying as she reads the letter of her daughter's expulsion from school. Some people erase or forget the violence or say it all happened in the old days. Maybe that's what pierces them most, not the silence, but the distance mistaken for the passage of time. It's not what happened in the old days. We carry the old days with us.
That's poet Kelley Bell. Today, she speaks with Etta Simpson Ray about the experience of living in the echo of a movement when your contributions have all but been erased. Finding the courage to risk personal gain for the collective good, and the critical importance of carrying the old days with us. Then Kelley shapes the circuit of this freedom rider's journey into poetry. From Nashville Public Radio, PRX, and the Porch Writers Collective, I'm Joshua Moore. This is Versify.
My name is Kelley Bell.
My name is Etta Marie Simpson Ray, doctor.
Well, it's such an honor to sit down with you and hear about your life and your story as a freedom rider. We'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your childhood and going into college and how you got involved in the movement.
Well, I had a great childhood. We did not know we were poor. My mother and father, Elroy and Laura Simpson. I have 11 siblings, including myself, 6 boys and 5 girls. We were raised partially in North Nashville until 1952, and we moved to East Nashville.
This was 2 years before the outcome of the Brown v. Board decision. So even with the move to East Nashville, the Simpson family's educational options were restricted to a predetermined set of all Black schools.
We had to ride the bus from East Nashville to North Nashville to go to high school, even though there was one close by us called East High School, all white, but we were not allowed to go there.
Ironically, Etta's experience being routed back to North Nashville for her high school years was in a way a strange precursor to the federally mandated busing programs which would come to be implemented many years later in the mid-1970s. At that time, both white and black parents, the white parents most stridently, would object to their children being shuffled off to distant schools to reverse the effects of segregation. But tellingly, when it was only black students being bused to preserve it, white parents had almost no complaints to offer on the issue. And beyond the added indignity of being relegated to the back of the bus, Miss Etta was under the burden of social prejudice, even just waiting on the street corner.
I remember one incident. I was standing on the bus stop downtown Nashville, and a white guy stuck his head out the window and spat on me. The next thing I knew, I was up in that window. But there was a black sailor standing there on the street, and he casually walked up to me and lifted me out of that bus window. To this day, I do not know who that person was, and I wished I knew, because he kept me from being hurt permanently or being arrested.
In spite of the social pressures arrayed against her, Miss Etta still has fond memories of her childhood.
I had a good social life. I had a good social life at home. My father had what was considered as a good job. He was a butcher at Newhoff Packing Company. My mother was basically a housewife. Every once in a while, she would go out and work a while, and then she would come back home. Because Daddy always kept 3 jobs. He worked at Newhoff Packing Company, and he had 2 cleanup jobs. So I say he was an entrepreneur. That was Daddy's life, taking care of his children. And he worked all the time.
Though they were of humble means, Etta's parents did their best to furnish their children with every opportunity. And chief among them was a chance at a quality education.
Well, I was the first child out of 11. I had a brother that's older than I am, and he didn't want to go to school. So when he was in the 11th grade, he begged Mom and Daddy to let him drop out of school. So I would have been the first one to go to college. And she and Daddy had said that anyone that wants to go to college, I will make sure that I pay their way.
And for her part, Etta's mother, who leaned on Etta for help with her younger siblings, always made sure she had whatever she needed.
And she really did count on me. But I did not know that until many, many years later, when she said to me, Etta, I never told you how much you helped me when I was raising the children. I did know that anything I asked her for, she would try to move, is that old saying, tooth and nails, however that old saying goes, to get whatever I needed in life, from making my clothes to having my hair done and letting herself go.
Etta's mother, to quote Etta, would move tooth and nail to get her what she needed, even when the process of getting it could be degrading.
When we went to places like Harvest, Castle Notch, and King's Lawns, you were followed around. They were watching you as if you were going to try to take something out of the store. So those are some of the things we went through. And when you went in places like Woolworths and Cress's and etc., they followed you, they watched you, but you could not sit down and eat at the food counters in those stores. Nor could you sit at the counter at Walgreens at the time either. So it was something that we did not like, but it was something that we accepted at the time.
But worse than finding yourself at a segregated lunch counter with an appetite was finding yourself there with a need to use the facilities.
When we had to use the bathroom, our mother would take us out in the alley between Harvest and Cress's and those streets that face Fifth Avenue. Mm-hmm. And if we were downtown shopping or something, we had to go to the bathroom. That's where we went. We went to the bathroom in the alley. Mm. And what Mama would do, she kind of like try to shield us while we went down there on the ground. That's what we had to do. And you had to make sure what you bought was what you needed, because, you may not be able to take it back. It was like, me being black. But how can you think that your color's going to rub off on somebody else? That was one of the craziest things. The color might rub off on you. It was so many crazy things that was said and went on back then. I mean, it was really, really, really crazy. I mean, sometimes you have to laugh when you think about stuff, because if you didn't, you'd be crying all the time.
Growing up through segregation and knowing its corrosive toll on Black people firsthand, Etta made a decision that she would find some way to be a part of making a change.
I was on my way home from school one day. I was on the bus stop. And if I remember correctly, there was a young man named Leo Lillard that was passing out papers on the bus stop. And he gave me one of the papers, and in a nutshell, he told me what it was about, that they were having these meetings downtown. They were having protesting downtown, and they were setting up, scheduling meetings where you could learn how to behave in situations and learn how to be nonviolent. So at that moment, I decided that, okay, I'm going to see what this is all about. And I had a friend, his name was William E. Ray. He borrowed his brother's car, and he would take me to the training sessions, even though he was not an activist at the time.
They were training for what would come to be known as the Nashville Student Movement, a coalition of like-minded undergraduates who were schooled in the Gandhian principles of nonviolence and worked in concert with Nashville's Black social and religious leaders to exercise direct action campaigns for the cause of integration.
I went to the training meetings, and I learned that I could be nonviolent. So I decided, okay, I'll be a part of the movement. So when I got into the movement, I would go downtown at that time, and I would protest at the theaters. And what we would do at the theaters, we would walk around in a circle. We'd go up to the window, ask for a ticket, which we knew we would be refused, and we just keep walking in that circle. So that was the biggest part of my action downtown, was at the theaters, more so than the restaurants. But when they bombed the bus in Alabama, that was when I made the decision that I decided that I wanted to become a freedom rider.
And Etta said the decision was almost more an instinct than an active choice.
The word, I believe, is circumstance. If that's the word that can be used. It's just something I can't really, it's just something deep within you that said, I'm going to do this. Mm-hmm. This is something I have to do.
That instinct to turn towards conflict rather than run from it reminded Kelley of Etta's encounter at the bus stop when she was a girl. And she asked Etta where she thought that courage of confronting risk head-on comes from.
Going towards those kind of dangerous moments. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, at the time, I think we knew what we were doing was dangerous, but we didn't look at it in that sense that we're doing something dangerous. All we wanted to do was to change the ways that we were being treated. We also knew that the different states were bringing in their own laws, Jim Crow laws, in order to not follow the laws from the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure that those laws were adhered to. So we didn't think in terms of danger. Mm-hmm. We didn't think in terms of, I want to be in history. And we also knew that we could die. But we didn't really think in terms of dying. We just wanted to do what we felt that was right for ourselves and our people. And we were really on the backs, that term I can use, of those people who had gone on before us. Mm-hmm. See, I mean, there was a lot to think about when you're doing things, but you may not think about it at the time. But we were really, as I always say, a link in the chain. A link in the chain from the past to the present to the future.
Stop and think for a minute about the audacity of this notion. A band of mostly black teenagers and 20-somethings in the 1960s Jim Crow South, outfitted with little more than a pacifist ideology and personal belief, positioning themselves as the judicial standard bearers of the country. A country whose democratic principles from its inception were actively constructed to exclude them. These children, like their unwearying predecessors, saw the just enactment of the law not only as their right, but as their particular responsibility, and that in their decision to take up that fight, they pushed the country closer to a realization of what it always claimed to be, but what for them, and ultimately their countrymen, would prove a principled act of bravery, was to their loved ones an injudicious gamble of their lives.
My parents, they objected. I think it was fear. I always say I believe my daddy was scared. I believe he was scared that something would happen to his children.
Yeah.
I feel like he was trying to protect us because at the time it was a possibility that people may disappear and you might not hear from them anymore. So he more or less was trying to protect us by saying, don't get involved.
And in truth, involvement in the movement had already wrought dramatic and long-lasting consequences for one member of the Simpson household.
Some of my brothers and one of my sisters had also become involved, but they were not, my parents did not know about their involvement. They were slipping off from school from time to time. And I had a sister, and she was injured very badly. She had slipped off from school and gone to a demonstration. And my mother and father found out about it when they called her from Mahara Hospital that she had to have an emergency surgery.
But perhaps greater than the threat of personal harm was the collective risk that their activism posed to the family. And Etta explained how even just the perception of stepping out of line could have tangible repercussions.
Daddy was the kind of person, he would always say, yes, sir, Mr. So-and-so. And the people he was around, the white people, Caucasian people, they just loved him. Oh, they just loved my daddy. But when my brother went to West Point, one of the people he had worked for over 20 years fired him. That's when he told us, well, he was already always close-mouthed. You don't tell anybody what you're doing. So those were the kind of things that happened. And if they had learned, I don't know what they would have done had they learned that I was a part of the Freedom Riders. But our names were always published. There was no secrecy about our name.
Though it potentially meant greater risk for their family, Etta's parents decided not to stand in her way.
Even though my parents protested, they did not try to stop me from going. The first trip I made was from Nashville to Birmingham, Alabama. I never will forget it. When we got to Birmingham, we were mobbed as we got off the bus at the bus station.
As civil rights demonstrations mounted across the South, white supremacist groups, often in coordination with local law enforcement, and at times under FBI sanction, mounted savage counterinsurgencies against demonstrators. Some of the most violent episodes transpired across Alabama in response to the first wave of freedom rides. The bus bombing in Anniston that Miss Etta referenced was one of those instances. And when she and the other Nashville students signed on to continue those demonstrations, they were again met with multiple waves of mob violence.
After maybe 10 or 15 minutes or whatever, then the so-called police would show up, but some of them were members of those other groups also, and sort of quieten things down or attempt to arrest us. So we were herded into the bus station, and we spent the night there. We had no lights, no water, no telephone, no use of the bathrooms. So somehow the next day, between the governments, Kennedy and others, we did get a bus and we were driven to Montgomery. The same thing happened in Montgomery. We were met by violence.
Alabama in particular was such a Klan state. They're so intertwined with the police force.
That's true.
To the point when maybe you didn't know that, there wasn't really much of a difference between the police force and the mob.
That's true.
And you all were going into, these things, knowing those things.
Mm-hmm.
Was there, on the buses or arriving, talking a little bit about those different states and the experience in those different states?
Well, what I can say about that is that being young people, we knew what was going to happen. But for some reason, instead of making us weak, it made us stronger. Because before we left, we did do final wills. So our minds were set on what we were going to do and what might happen to us.
Was there a moment where it was really hard to be nonviolent? Was there a moment when it was really tested for you?
It was tested throughout the whole movement.
Mm-hmm.
If you were not nonviolent and you got into a group where they were beating people, where they had guns and etc., if you had lifted your hands, more than one or more of us would have been killed, shot, right there on the spot. The way the law was at the time, we were the ones that were in the wrong. Whatever was happening with the other groups, the whites, the Ku Klux Klan and whatever, it was like they were in the right because we were in their territory. Mm. When the territory belonged to all of us, according to the laws of the land. Mm. And they wanted what? Separate but equal. It was not separate but equal. It was separate, separate, separate. You stay on your side, we'll stay on our side. There's no equal to that.
Helping buffet the anxieties that Etta and the other students faced was the comfort and support they received from members of Montgomery's Black community, who risked their well-being to shepherd the Freedom Riders out of the bus station and shelter them in their own homes.
People in general that you would never, ever hear their names. They supported us. When they fed us, they bedded us, they transported us in their cars. They put their lives in danger. Some people really, stood out where others didn't stand out, but they were still supporting us. Even though we were out there doing the marches, we were riding the buses, there were still other people that were not standing out there, but they were with us.
Back then, risk was a constant for anyone associated with the movement, particularly the Nashville students. And yet, even while they were willing to hazard their lives, they still hoped not to in jeopardy their educations.
We were at a meeting, and we received the word that we needed to get back to Nashville. Back in Nashville, I had to take my exams at Tennessee State. My teachers that I had allowed me to take exams even though I was late. I even went to one professor's home and taken my exam. But I was able to finish that semester at Tennessee State. But going back to the Freedom Rides, after I came back to Nashville, I got on the bus again. And I went from Nashville to Memphis to Mississippi. In Mississippi, when we got off the buses, the blacks went into the white waiting room. The whites went into the black waiting room. We were ordered to move to the opposite rooms, whites to the white and blacks to the black. But we refused, and then we were loaded on the paddy wagon and taken to the jail.
And this is Jackson?
Yeah, it was Jackson, Mississippi. And, of course, we were fingerprinted and all the other things they do to you when you're arrested and placed in a cell. And I did not stay very long in Mississippi. I ended up bonding out and coming back to Nashville. Now, when you read papers and things, it's going to tell you that I was there 30 days. But I'm not exactly sure because I don't totally remember everything. But I do remember bonding out and coming back to Nashville. I got on an airplane. I had never been on an airplane before. We flew through a thunderstorm. That was scary, but that was my first adventure on a plane. I cannot remember where that plane landed. I cannot remember how I got from that plane to my mom and daddy's front door. I cannot remember at all. It's all gone.
But there is a memory in the weeks following her return from Mississippi that Etta says she can never forget. While she and the other students had taken pains to keep up their academics, even while participating in the rides, unbeknownst to Etta and 13 other Tennessee A&I students, the price of their involvement would be the very educations they'd attempted to protect. Because Tennessee A&I was a state school, it was subject to the oversight of Tennessee's Board of Regents. And though the university faculty may have been with the Freedom Riders, the members of the Regent Board decidedly were not. At their insistence, the 14 A&I students who were arrested in Mississippi were to be expelled from the university post-haste. Many of them were still incarcerated in Mississippi when the verdict was delivered. And for Etta, she didn't learn of her expulsion until her mother got a letter in the mail.
I can remember that the area we were in, picture perfect. I had come into the room from outside and I was in the hallway. I can remember just her holding that letter in her hand, standing in the hallway in our house. And she was crying because I had been put out of school. It just hurt her that bad. I would have been the first kid to go to college. I still vividly can see her right now holding that paper and writing. It has never left my mind.
How did you feel at that moment?
That I had let her and my daddy down. Mm-hmm. I had let her and daddy down. But it was like, it wasn't nothing I could do but just stand there, and it was just so overwhelming. I couldn't say nothing. I couldn't move. I don't know how long we stood there. I can't even remember why I hugged her or whether I started crying. All I can remember is her in that hallway. That's all I can say. But that may have been the thing that just kind of stopped me cold.
So when you got back to Nashville, what did you do after that?
It was like no one talked about it.
Really?
No one spoke about the movements. In your homes, in some homes I'll say, my home, we didn't even talk about it. And as a whole, Nashville didn't really talk about it. But it was like a silence. You know, it happened, it's over.
Did you have a sense of victory? Or, coming back to silence, how did that also make you feel? Did you feel like you had accomplished something? At what point did you recognize?
We knew that we had accomplished something.
Okay, yeah.
We knew that we had done tremendously in what we done. But it was like, and the only thing I could compare it to, and I don't know, but you remember, you hear soldiers and things talking about they were not recognized when they came back from the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. If you had been a soldier at that time, it would probably have been a similar feeling. There was a quietness about it. And you may have been fearful that if you put this on your job application, you may not get hired. Mm-hmm. Because if you put down there, I was a freedom rider, even though the courts had turned all of that over to say that they were not guilty of anything. It was just like, that's how it was. People were still being active in different segments, but it was an overall hush.
I'm struck by this comparison Miss Etta makes between the Freedom Riders and soldiers returning from war. particularly given the historic disenfranchisements of Black GIs following the Korean and Second World Wars. However, 1 million Black servicemen and their families were systematically denied access to the life-altering resources of the GI Bill, not in spite of, but because of their service to their country. Because the people, the legislators who enshrined the systems of Jim Crow segregation, refused to honor or acknowledge the value of their sacrifice. And the burden of returning to that landscape with a history you couldn't translate even to your family.
It was only about 12 years, maybe 13 years ago, when I began to talk. And my brother that lives in Atlanta, he kind of brought me out of that. And my sister, Norma Kathleen Simpson, that was injured here in Nashville, she still won't talk about the incident that caused her to have emergency surgery. And we never talked about the Freedom Ride, so it was just like, nothing happened, if you can explain it that way. And my sisters and brothers, and some of them, they were young. Some of them didn't know anything about it. But Etta, I didn't know you was in there because they were really young. And see, by me saying that, parents didn't talk to them about me being away. I didn't know where you were. I thought you just left home. Things like that would be, but they didn't realize, what I had actually done. So it was just like, okay, I was at home with my mom and daddy, and I was at home with mom and daddy till I got married, and I just worked. That was it. I didn't go back to school at the time. I didn't go back to school till after I got married. And when I started trying to go back to school. So, I was getting on up there then. At least 30-something. And so, but it was just everyday living.
Because of that enduring silence, in the months and years after the Freedom Rides, the contributions of Miss Etta and the other A&I students seemed to get lost in the shuffle of history, even in the communities and institutions of which they were a part.
It's not a lot about it, I guess, in the school system or somewhere, because you still have people that don't even know. I've met students from Tennessee State all along the way. And I said, have you heard about the Freedom Rider? No, I haven't heard about the Freedom Rider. That's the sad part about it, but It's like all history. Some things are always told, will be known, and then somehow or other they get pushed back. It's just like a new building. A building can stay downtown for 50 or 60 years. Then they refurbish that building and say, we're going to take this man's name off of it and put another name on there. That's happening down here now. You may not know it. It's just like the name of a street. For years, there was Charlotte Avenue over there. Now it's Martin Luther King's Boulevard, which is good. But I'm saying that's how things roll in history. For so long, it stays in the forefront, and then it's pushed backwards. Then it comes back out again. At some point, somebody's going to remember some of the stuff that's been changed just right here in Nashville, Tennessee.
While largely the lack of recognition for the A&I Freedom Riders' efforts was due to state policy and the selective telling of history, Etta says she wonders if at the level of the community there was more they could have done to protect the legacies of the movement. And she recalls a memory where that sense of questioning became painfully distinct.
What I think we forgot is how to handle ourselves after the movement as a whole, not individuals, not the 300 and something or 400 and some people that were involved in going to jail. But somehow or other, this is my personal feelings, and I'm sure some of the other leaders probably won't feel the same way. We did not have a good backup plan. Yes, we kept protesting. We spoke about it. But somehow along the way, some of the younger people that came along behind us, after they could go basically and live where they wanted to live, go in any hotel they wanted to go to, go down and have maybe a better reputation with a car dealership, go in a restaurant and sit down and eat instead of bringing out a greasy bag or going to a back door. Somehow or other, something got lost to me. And I remember after I went back to Tennessee State, I was in a juvenile justice class. I believe it's called juvenile justice. And we had sort of talking back and forth about the way things were then and the way the things were at the present in that class. And one of the young people here, I'm an older lady, much older lady now, said, well, that was in your day, this is in our day. What happened in the old days always reflect on the new days. It's not what happened in the old days. It's what we're carrying with us. And, you know, that just pierced me as if someone had stuck a knife in my flesh. And then I began to realize that you got better paying jobs. It's more blacks in the political arena. You've got this great big beautiful house on the hill, and you're in earthly heaven. Earthly heaven. But it's not that way. It's still a long ways to go. And you still got to keep pushing. Because you have those people that want to turn things back.
That ability to imagine oneself as functionally distinct from the consequences of history, even a history as recent as 60 years past, betrays a fundamental lack of awareness. We are all the byproducts of the complex, overlapping narratives that preceded us. But if we never learn the content of those histories, it can be all but impossible to see how they exist within the context of our lives. It took until 2008, nearly a half century on from the time of their expulsion, for the state of Tennessee to acknowledge the content of those 14 A&I students' contributions to our state history by awarding them honorary doctorates, a gesture which even then was initially opposed by the Board of Regents.
For a long time afterwards, I felt like the president at Tennessee State was against us, but they were not. They had to take care of their jobs, and they did what they could to help us. They may not outwardly helped us where it could be seen in public, but behind the scenes, they were there. It was not, per se, and I'm using the black folks at TSU, it was those above them. And, you know, when you're trying to keep your job, which they were, I know, I understand, you got to follow those rules up there or either you just leave. So it wasn't Tennessee State that done us wrong. It was the system. The ones that got put out of Tennessee State or A&I, we were labeled as the Freedom Riders 14. That's the name that we carry. But somewhere along the way, there was a push and we were recognized at Tennessee State. And I'm telling you, they treated us like we were the president of the United States. We had about 3 or 4 days of festivities when they recognized us for what we had done.
And perhaps reflecting again on the significance of Etta's statement about the Freedom Riders seeing themselves as a link in the chain, Kelley asked Etta what advice she has for people continuing that work of social activism.
There are a lot of different kinds of protests by young people these days and activism. What do you say, or what would you say to young people right now?
I say glory be to them. But be sure that you are correct in what you are protesting. Be sure that it is the right thing for you to do. Don't just jump out there and get involved in something because you want to be a part of it. Know what you're doing. Know what you're getting into and learn about the repercussions. You may not know the end game because we didn't know what the end game was going to be, but we knew what we were trying to change. But you need to have some basis on what you're doing. And if that's what you need to do, you do it. Do it with all your heart and mind and your soul. Do what you feel is necessary to do.
When we come back, We'll hear from Kelley about the experience of speaking to a pillar of Tennessee state history and find out how she navigates the route of this freedom rider's journey through poetry. This is Versify.
The justice system is complicated. I'm Paige Flager, and as WPLN's criminal justice reporter, I'm constantly asking, is the system working? And who is it working for?
The system is broken. I think it's more punitive than anything.
And this is not about justice anymore. This is about vengeance.
We're trying to get justice from a justice system that failed us.
How policies impact real people. Hear their stories here on WPLN News.
In learning about this history, I've thought a lot about the consequences of decisions, what people measured or mortgaged to make one choice over another. And that for Etta's family in particular, the literal dollars that Etta used for her tuition were something that her parents sweat and toiled for her to be the first of their kids to achieve this dream of going to college. And the difficulty, grappling with the pain of that vision not quite being realized the way they thought it would.
Such an anticlimax in a lot of ways. And when she had said that like some of her younger siblings didn't know that she was involved at all until way later, it was just really heartbreaking of like, yeah, sometimes when things like that happen and trauma, but also, it's just something so big and courageous and something that like really the world was looking on, but inside like one house it can be quiet. And so, yeah, I think what struck me is those different points of someone's life when you're asking, what do we do now? And so often that answer is stepping into greater danger, but also kind of after all that, sometimes maybe the hardest to process is something that's not as, a battle that's not as clear. This is called Carry the Days. There are some things she can't remember, gaps in time that she carries around like empty pockets. Sometimes she sees a photograph or someone asks, do you remember being in that basement? And she can't grasp it, she can't feel its weight. Then again, some memories break open like wintered seeds. A night spent in the bus terminal, the siege of white robes, the quiet help of strangers, a church haloed in tear grass. She remembers bus stops in Tennessee, like the one in Nashville where a man stuck his head out of the window just to spit on her, or the one where a young man ushered her into the discipline of nonviolence. And yes, the ones in Alabama and Mississippi, the ones where violence seethed over them and they decided to go on, and decided to go on, and decided to go on. Somehow her clearest memory is afterwards, of her mother in the doorway of the bedroom, crying as she reads the letter of her daughter's expulsion from school. The weight of what her mother and father had spent, all the yes sirs and other assents, so she could be the first to finish college. Everything had changed, but still, sometimes it was hard to feel the victory. She returned from the rides, flying through thunder and rain, and through the storm of the country just beginning to open its eyes. She came back and walked into the silence of years. Now, Nashville buildings shed their inconvenient histories. Stores offer her credit cards, the same stores that made her siblings relieve themselves in back alleys while their mother shielded them from the street. The hateful still hide fists in their pockets and dress their heroes in new clothes. Some people erase or forget the violence or say it all happened in the old days. Maybe that's what pierces the most, not the silence, but the distance mistaken for the passage of time. It's not what happened in the old days. We carry the old days with us. Now silences break open. She is full of days and words and songs. We carry the old days with us. She says, don't forget. She says, we must carry on. We carry the old days with us. She speaks and sings and prays, so her freedom is not made into artifact. She prays that we carry the old days with us.
Versify is a production of Nashville Public Radio and The Porch, which trains our poets and hosts our storytelling events. This season of Versify is brought to you in partnership with Choral Arts Link and the Nashville Symphony Orchestra. Special thanks to Margaret Campbell-Holman, Kelley Bell, Joshua Randall, and Kimberly McLemore, who helped make these conversations a reality. Editing for this episode came from WPLN's Mack Linebaugh, with additional editing from Anita Bugg. The season was written and produced by me, Joshua Moore. Carl Peterson masters the show. And tune in again to hear the beauty of how we can turn your life into poetry, one verse at a time.
Versify is no longer in production, but you can still go back and hear past episodes in any podcast app, including the stories of other Nashville freedom writers. Thanks for listening to this special edition of the Nash Villager podcast. Let's make this MLK Day a meaningful one, and we'll catch back up again tomorrow.